So you just start by giving me whatever is like the spiel.
Is it running?
I'm running.
The spiel about the gallery. We have 25 artists, 4,200 square feet, and we have a juried show in the center with 10 additional artists right now. And we have one of the biggest venues probably in the city, I mean, among the biggest venues. We have very high ceilings, which is wonderful, because it sort of changes things. We can kind of walk through and get a little bit of feel. This is a great artist named Tim Jag, who I absolutely love. He's really very, very strong. He's all about gradation of color. He comes from the sort of Barnett Newman School of Art. And then as we wander through here, we have an artist from Tufts University originally named Gillespie Adams, Roland Ostein, who's this wonderful young artist who I absolutely love. And this is our jury show, which is all new artists to the gallery. There's 10 of them, there were about 200 who submitted, and there's 10 who got in, which is fairly typical of Santa Fe. There's a lot of very, very strong artists, and as a result, you end up with a situation where even really strong artists don't necessarily get into a gallery. So it's a very challenging climate. These little adobe houses, but it's just like being in New York City in a lot of ways. So it's interesting. It's an interesting, very high-pressure environment, and it doesn't often look like that from the outside. It looks like a fun, touristy place to come. What else?
What do you mean by high-pressure environment?
Well, because you're in the second biggest art market in the country after New York, and it's only 80,000 people. So there's this really strong intensification that happens with a lot of the clients and a lot of the artists and a lot of the competition being, all contained in a very small space. So what you end up with is this kind of pressure cooker situation, which actually doesn't happen in New York or LA because it's more spread out and there's kind of more of an open-ended environment. Here there's this local versus international vibe. So the art business is very international, but there's this local component where there's a lot of feuding and kind of different things, and they correlate and they cause quite an intense environment for people to operate in.
Like small-town gossip type thing?
Some of that, but also artists who are international but are based here, and there's a lot of egos involved, and there's a lot of big money involved, so that kind of escalates everything. But you see them, you have FaceTime with gallery owners, gallery directors, and artists who are at an international level, which you don't get in New York. When you go to New York or go to LA, it's like they're the high priests of the art business. You have to get buzzed in. You never really see Larry Gagosian or Pace Wildenstein people at a leadership level. But here, you walk in and you have access at that level all the time. So it's a very interesting combination of small town and large scale operations in terms of the amount of money it costs to run a gallery, what it takes to sell here, and the kind of numbers that are coming in out of Santa Fe, just like New York. But you have access. So it's a very different climate in that respect.
Gotcha. So, let's see. Want to walk? What do you say?
I don't know, whatever you want. You're going to edit this anyway, right? So I can
Yeah, well, it'll be all edited, don't worry. So on a given day, I'm just curious, like, what's your given day like?
My given day. Well, I mean, my colleagues will probably disagree on some of this, but anyway. Basically, my function is to operate a sort of an overarching strategic plan for the gallery through a social and economic lens. So in every aspect of my work and my social life within this small town, I have to operate from the standpoint of the gallery's numbers. So my personality as such is sort of separate from my real private personality at home. That's another thing that happens in Santa Fe, is that you're very visible all the time because it's so small. So you have to have the polish constantly, as opposed to being able to just, get on the subway and go uptown and not see anybody that you would deal with downtown. Here it's like this constantly. There's always clients, there's always dealers, there's always people who can make or break your business. So your commitment is very different. So my job, I have two responsibilities. One is to sell consistently at a level that keeps the doors open. And the other is to be a very visible presence socially at gallery openings and at events so that I can partly be the face of the gallery. Our assistant director is also very active in that way, but she also does all of the advertising administration side of it, which is gigantic as well. So my main operation is sales and social,
Gotcha.
which correlate. So
That makes sense. So, couple questions. One, what are the numbers that keep the doors open?
I can't talk about that. But generally, I'd like to go over here because I left them Jack.
Sure.
Generally, you're looking at the mid to high 5 figures to 6 figures a month to operate a gallery on Canyon Road. So that would be, I'm not going to say specifically to this space, but your average operating is probably $40,000 to $100,000 a month, depending on what level you're operating at. When you have a little, Adobe place like this, people freak out when they hear those kind of numbers. So it's very much that sort of the range. My average sale is 8,000 to 15,000, and that is about. I'm very conscious and cognizant of the fact that those are the numbers that I have to bring down. I don't want to say it's all about numbers. It's very much about the art. You have art galleries, and then you have what I call money galleries. It's fairly easy to identify as a collector when you walk in the door what a money gallery is, because they approach you from the standpoint of money before they approach you from the standpoint of art. They're very eager to discuss numbers versus aesthetic. Those things are very hard to get away from in the art business because it's so hyper-competitive. My focus, not to get too esoteric, but my spiritual focus is to look at work from an aesthetic standpoint first, and then to look at the numbers later. And the clients like that as well, because if a person who has ample funds to buy art comes into an art gallery, the last thing they want to talk about is money. Money is not their issue. Aesthetic and experience is their issue. So you're going to get away from the money and have it almost be an afterthought. And then if it's $150,000 that they're writing a check for, it's really not the issue. The issue is more, have they had a profound and beautiful experience with the art, with the people who are operating on their behalf, and going home with a smile on their face. Not to sound too corny, but that's a big part of it.
Sure. Well put.
Thanks.
How often do you sell pieces, though?
It's absolutely random. That's the one thing that's the hardest part of being in this business, is that some artists will have 3 or 4 months with nothing, and then they'll sell 4 pieces in 2 days. Sometimes I'll sell one major piece, like for example, fairly recently I sold a wonderful sculpture by a Belarusian artist named Dmitry German for I think about 38,000. Other times there'll be lots of little sales. So that it always ends up working, but there's no sort of specific formula or thing that happens. It just ends up always working because we, I guess, have the people that I work with and I have reached sort of critical mass in terms of knowing this business. So we don't go into a flop sweat. We don't go into hysteria when things are slow for 3 weeks. We realize that it changes, and it's a kind of like an organic thing. So, sometimes it's 5 pieces for X amount of dollars. Sometimes it's 1 piece for a large amount of dollars. Again, the focus is always on correlating the aesthetic experience with what the client's actual needs are in terms of their space at home, and those are the things that bring us in. Money is critical, but it's not important in terms of the larger picture.
Gotcha. And do you buy art?
I do. I have probably 35 or 40 paintings and maybe 8 sculptures. 7 or 8 sculptures. I collect very eclectically. I have no interest in buying to a specific formula. The first instinct is always the right instinct in terms of everything, in terms of falling in love, in terms of seeing a painting. If you don't have that gut instinct and that butterfly thing going on, then you really shouldn't buy the piece, no matter how much they tell you it's going to go up by. Whether it's, those things are irrelevant. The emotional response is the first thing you should look for. Every piece of art that I own, I would never sell. They have value. I can use them to leverage other things, but I wouldn't sell them. But yes, I've been buying art since I was 18, so for nearly 20 years, and I've been working in the art business for 19.
Do you make art? Are you an artist?
I write, and I play the piano, and I studied opera, so I sing periodically, but for me, my main creative and artistic process is in human relationship and in an energetic relationship between people and between artworks, and I see myself as like the third in that dynamic. And actually, being in a room with one person who's a collector or a couple who's collecting a piece of art and myself is more poetic and more exciting to me than being in a romantic relationship. That to me is like my ultimate, that triangle of beauty and newness and all of those things. One of the great things about being in this business is that you can always, it's always like a new relationship. It's very exciting, and people who are drawn to this business are always kind of on that upward swing of a new relationship, because you're meeting people for the first time, you're selling them something beautiful, and then it's sort of consummated and over. So it's like this intensified form of creativity, which I really enjoy.
Got it. I want to see that somehow.
I don't have any, someone's walking in right now, but it's not a client. But yeah, at some point we could probably, see, watching the process or having a camera in the room or having another person in the room changes the entire dynamic. In fact, where you're sitting in the room changes the dynamic. If you're standing in a doorway versus not standing in a doorway, it changes the dynamic. If you're sitting down versus standing up, it changes the dynamic. And whenever I'm training these salespeople, I always say it's kind of like downhill skiing, really fast, having to look, but also like brain surgery, because you're doing this minute manipulation with your hands. It's a combination of those two things. So it's very, very minute and subtle. And at the same time, it's very intense and fast, and there's a lot of speed. The first piece of advice I give to new salespeople is never, ever, ever focus on how much money is involved. Always, always focus on the emotional experience in life and in this business. It's critical that the gut response, that the emotional, authentic response be followed. And it's a lot about consciousness, and it's a lot about spirituality, and it's not, and that's why I say getting away from money. The money will always come in this business, but the people who are in it to hustle are not going to survive. The people who are in it for love and for passion and for consciousness and for the things that are relevant to everything in the world, but especially to a highly charged emotional space like being in the art business, are the ones who are going to survive. Everyone's emotional in this interaction. The artist is emotional because they love making the piece. The seller wants to steward the piece properly, and the person who's buying it is buying it because they love it, hopefully. So that's all about love, and it's a very charged environment. So there's a lot of emotionality, and if you don't know how to handle that, you burn out.
Got it. Again, very well put.
Thank you.
The way you talk about it, it does sound like an artist talking about their process.
Well, for me, because I was born with an artistic impulse, but I'm not an artist, and I studied opera, which doesn't make any money, so I changed to art history because I knew I needed to make a living. So for me, it's about being as close to the creative process as possible and stewarding my portion of the creative process in the same way that an artist stewards their work. So it is, for me, an artistic process, and the best people in this business are in it in a vulnerable way, and their skin is off, and they're real, authentic. Otherwise, you're just selling cars, and you might as well go and sell cars. Art is very different from that, and it's permanent, and it's a timeline, an aesthetic timeline of human history. And there's a lot of, I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but there's a lot of important elements to that, because what you're actually doing, it's like an aesthetic DNA strand. You have a responsibility to steward beauty through generations and generations of art. And you're part of that, you're part of that thread. So all the way back to, the Elmira Caves and the Venus of Willendorf, all the way up to the postmodern, piece of string on the wall with a tag through it. I mean, all of it is relevant. If it exists, it's real to the creative process. And you can correlate